My name, the recording is in progress. And my name is Anastasia Bobrova. I am analyst and project manager here at Cedos. And I welcome you to this wonderful event about finance and investment instruments for social and affordable housing. And today we are going to talk about that. And affordable housing is urban infrastructure, like public transport, like schools and hospitals. And without affordable and comfortable housing, the cities cannot function properly and they become unbearable places to live and work. Unfortunately, sometimes housing is not perceived as an essential urban infrastructure, and therefore urban policies sometimes omit the issues of housing. Housing affordability always costs money, and it is also a political task to organize these effective mechanisms to reach the goal of affordability and provide housing for everyone in need. And today, as never, the issues of housing are extremely important in Ukraine, as the war that Russia started on the 21st of February, it brought this unprecedented housing crisis. And therefore, we need to find new ways to renew our housing policy and to, in the future, provide this affordable housing for everyone. And today, with our wonderful speakers, we are going to talk more about finance and investment mechanisms for affordable housing. And I'm also grateful for our speakers that they agreed to participate in this event. And I present to you Julie Lawson. She is an adjunct professor in the Center of Urban Research in RMIT University. She's also an editorial board member of Housing Theory and Society Journal, and she is a lead author of the UN report Housing 2030. We also have with us Michelle Norris, and she is a professor of social policy. She is a director of Geary Institute for Public Policy at the University College Dublin. We also have Grzegorz Gajda. He is a senior urban specialist at European Investment Bank, and Katerina Zisimopoulou. She is also a senior urban specialist in European Investment Bank. And today, first, we are going to talk a little bit about Housing 2030 report. What is this report about? Who are behind this report? And then we will talk also about the instruments that this report proposes for increasing housing affordability. Then we will later also move to the European Investment Bank activities. What are they doing in financing social and affordable housing? And then we will discuss also financial sustainability of social housing. Later on, we will have some time for question and answer, for discussion. And I know that the majority of people watch us on Facebook and also will watch us the recorded version of our presentation. But for those of you who are here live with us, I invite you to share all your questions and answers, questions and comments here in the Zoom chat or on Facebook, and then we will have some time for discussion. Thank you once again, and without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Julie Lawson.
Thank you very much, Anastasia. It's a real pleasure to be invited to be here, and I think it's also a marvelous initiative of Cedos to have a public discussion about housing policy, and also make that available as you are online later. I understand on YouTube, so that's terrific. We'll also do the same. We'll link to this presentation. We'll make that available on our website, on the UNEC, UN Habitat and Housing Europe joint website of Housing 2030. So without further ado, I will open my screen and hopefully you can see our PowerPoint today. This is in Ukrainian. Both the English version and the Ukrainian version will be made available online on the Housing 2030 website. Now, I should introduce who I am. I've already been very nicely welcomed by Anastasia. Thank you. I'm also here with Michelle Norris. Both of us have quite some experience in housing finance and affordable housing in particular. Chair Michelle, of course, was the chair of the Irish Housing Finance Agency for over 10 years. And the research that I've been involved with the Geary was involved in forming actually the National Housing Finance Investment Corporation, which is now up and running and funding affordable housing in Australia. So both of us bring that experience, but also 2 years worth of research for this study, which was done called Housing 2030. And we'd like to tell you a little bit about that and also about how we came to choose what we're going to talk about today as well. So first and foremost, the main message that we would like to give is that it takes purposeful housing promotion to shape good recovery outcomes that improve long-term social, economic and environmental sustainability. So we know that housing in particular is the foundation for social and economic well-being, and also for post-war reconstruction and recovery. We know also that homes and neighbourhoods have been by far the most affected in the current crisis. At least 1/3 of the cost of the damage is to residential structures, but these are homes and neighbourhoods, and it requires very, very focused attention on those towards a long-term effort, including building effective institutions and policy tools for these things, for the repair of housing, for the renovation of housing, and the renewal of homes in a neighbourhood as well. That must be integral to any recovery plan. And of course, we can learn from the recoveries of other European cities as well, and how they have shaped their housing policies, also through wartime devastation, also through recovering from that. And we know that with those European cities, strategic investment for reconstruction and very far-sighted land policy and effective models of affordable housing provision were key for them. And many of the institutions that were established, or at least reviewed, revised and grown after World War II, are still there with us in Vienna, in Rotterdam, in Rovaniemi, in Finland, in Copenhagen, in many, many German cities. You will find those same institutions that were grown and nurtured and expanded after World War II are still there playing a role in the recovery of Europe today. So they're part of the Green Deal, they're part of the recovery plans, they're part of the Bauhaus initiative, they're part of the affordable housing initiative with 100 cities. So these kind of institutions are very, very important for recovery, but also for continuation. Building institutional capacity in these areas will be essential also to Ukraine. And if we keep front and center SDG 11 on the Sustainable Development Goals on safe, adequate, affordable and inclusive housing, and SDG 16 on peace, justice and strong institutions that help guide recovery, social solidarity and public confidence and trust for a brighter future. And so this presentation focuses on some of the tools which, from following the recovery plan process and listening to Cedos's suggestions, also reviewing the research that's been done by Cedos and by researchers in Ukraine, we've tried to pull out of Housing 2030 what could be relevant and useful. I mentioned a number of cities, Rovaniemi, Vienna, Rotterdam and Cologne, and I'd just like to stress that for all of them, land policy, strategic investment flows and public interest housing promoters were actually vital to their recovery. So what is Housing 2030? Well, Housing 2030, like this Rubik's Cube suggests, is made up of different, if you like, dimensions. We see housing as comprising of different dimensions that together shape what it is. So those dimensions include the kind of arrangements around land and property rights, the kind of rules that shape how investment flows through housing, the kind of governance arrangements, where do people fit within that governance, for example, and the rules and regulations that affect them. Also in terms of the kind of standards that we set for housing, environmental standards in particular regarding energy efficiency, but also other standards like affordability, also overcrowding, also energy efficiency, as I mentioned. So Housing 2030 is an initiative of Housing Europe, which is a federation of 43,000 housing promoters, if you like, cooperatives, also public housing and not-for-profit housing, and they might be not-for-profit private agencies, also not-for-profit public agencies. So there's 43,000 of them which form this federation called Housing Europe. It's based in Brussels. There's UN Habitat, which of course I'm sure you know of, which is the UN's Agency for Human Settlements. And then there's the UNECE, which is the UN Economic Commission for Europe. That later one covers 56 countries and all the way from Vancouver to Vladivostok, so 56 countries, mainly in the north. The joint initiative focused on solutions to housing affordability in dealing with the housing affordability concerns of many of these countries in the region, highlighting the need for coordinated and strategic action on housing governance, access to finance, which we'll focus on today, access and availability of land, also crucial, also to affordability, and climate neutral housing construction and renovation. The process over 2 years involved an extensive consultation, also involving Ukraine and Ukraine's Minister for Housing, which engaged researchers, policymakers, and housing providers and advocates, reaching over 1,200 actual participants in a range of mediums, from webinars and seminars in different parts of Europe, etc. The report primarily focuses on institutions and tools. It's not so much showcasing particular projects or particular houses. It's about the things, the institutions which make those things possible. There's a Ukrainian version of the same table that I provided before, and you can see the color coded for the different areas: governance, finance, land, and environmental standards. As I mentioned, Housing 2030 has been involved in Ukraine's recovery plan process, along with Cedos, as part of the housing policy working group of the recovery plan. It's trying to understand the context and connect with local stakeholders where useful for them, to exchange expertise towards building stronger capacity. We see many areas of practical knowledge that could be useful potentially to catalyse policy development within Ukraine itself, building its own capacity and working peer-to-peer with like-minded for technical assistance. The areas which, in discussion with Cedos and mindful of the progress of the housing policy working group, appear to be around governance frameworks towards a national housing strategy involving multi-level governance on sustainable development, housing needs assessment in transparent ways, reporting on this, budgeting for this, investing strategically to address those needs, on sustainable and inclusive social housing systems that certainly need broader expansion and will be vital for the recovery effort to ensure there's no one left behind and no city left behind. Also, public interest land development promotion. We see this as part and parcel of channeling investment efficiently and effectively, working together with municipalities. Also, we see taxation as a vital tool to ensure positive investment in affordable housing and prevent the underutilisation of assets, for example, or through either excessive speculation, money going to the wrong assets, and also in dealing with housing vacancy, for example. Again, housing standards, tenant landlord regulation for secure quality housing, absolutely vital, because especially in a crisis, you need actually more intervention, not less. So rent regulation is almost essential in a crisis situation. And don't forget resident involvement and advocacy. In doing something for someone doesn't mean that they have to be disempowered in the process, and thinking about their involvement, their capacity is important. Also, those people who are not in Ukraine at the moment, who are residing in refuge elsewhere, they themselves can also build their capacity, especially women who are with children in many of these countries. Governance is one of the key chapters. I won't spend too much time on these, but these are the key tools that are outlined and illustrated in the report. And you can find each of those elaborated with examples of good practice. We pull out some that might be interesting for Ukraine today. The first one is the development of an effective housing strategy. And one of the most comprehensive and effective and productive strategies of recent times has been the housing strategy of Scotland, the More Homes Scotland report. And it does provide an example of relevant ideas in the area of needs-based strategic investment, working together with municipalities, lifting the standards of energy efficiency, especially addressing the costs of that standard improvement for housing for low-income people. It's a very comprehensive strategy that aims to produce a significant 100,000 dwellings within a short period of time. It's already produced over 50,000 dwellings in its short prior version until 2016. It's a very effective and productive strategy and worth looking at. In terms of actual agencies, many countries with very effective housing policies also have a clearly nominated agency that has expertise specifically in this area of affordable housing promotion. One of the most effective national agencies that works together with municipalities is the Finland's Housing Finance and Development Agency. Obviously, the way in which the Ministry of Regions works at the moment will need considerable expansion in the social housing programs or broader-based affordable housing programs, probably also particularly in rental promotion. You can see the Housing Finance Development Corporation of Agency of Finland working in all those fields, and it would be very, very interesting to get to know and understand how that particular agency works in promoting a broad range of tenures for young and old, with a focus on affordability, inclusive neighbourhoods and energy efficiency. Another key agency which you see being very, very effective as best practice in Europe is in one of Europe's most livable cities of Vienna. The backbone behind that Viennese model, a Viennese success story, is something called Woonfond, which is the land banker which develops and delivers required sites to ensure that they are available. It co-invests in affordable housing and conducts very interesting forms of competition, which it has specified what are the pillars of that competition, and they include, of course, value for money for the tenants, and energy efficiency, social inclusion, and so on. Very, very interesting. From former Soviet countries, Slovakia's state housing program also provides a very interesting almost template for how to do 5-yearly plans, and also establish a revolving fund to invest in and improve housing stock. 70% of the former Soviet housing in Slovakia is in very good condition through this revolving fund, and it's worth getting to know that. We talked a little bit about rent regulation, which can ensure fair and responsible tenant-landlord relations. There are many different ways in which this can be organised and set in legislation and implemented and applied. We know that since the beginning of the Russian aggression, there has been enormous displacement of people to the west of the country, placing pressure on the rental market, and you see significant, very significant increases in rents. For example, in Lviv of 74%, as according to research that's been done, I think also by Cedos on this topic. So clearly, whatever is regulating rents at the moment is ineffective and would have to be reformed. And in this particular box, we give different ways in which the basis for setting rents can be organised. I won't go through this, there's not enough time, but it's important to know that there is almost no European country that has unregulated rents. Almost all European countries have them. For example, Switzerland and Germany, which have the largest rental sectors in Europe, also have the most extensive regulations on their rent setting and indexing. So it's part and parcel of a successful rental market is to have effective forms of rent setting and indexing. Another city which, of course, has gone through heavy damage during wartime is Rotterdam. And it's important to know how Rotterdam was recovered and rebuilt. In that process, many housing developments were made possible by municipal land policy, via leasing the land and playing a leading role in construction by housing associations. Today, rents on modest dwellings are based on a legislated point system for those relating to quality and indexed by policy. The minister actually sets what the index rate will be. That, of course, is a discussion. And right now, that policy is being reformed because it wasn't effective enough. So these things, of course, should adapt over time as required. Also in the Netherlands is a system of rent allowances, which aim to ensure affordability and are linked to people's households' taxable income. Today in Rotterdam, social housing is actually 55% of the stock in the city. It's provided by not-for-profit housing corporations, providing low to mid-price rental, and is also involved in selling dwellings as well, but the receipts from those sales come back into the revolving fund to replace those dwellings and keep supply expanding. Rent regulation works a particular way in the Netherlands according to a quality and space point system. As I mentioned, in other countries, it works in different ways. Some countries apply a cost rent model, some apply a below market rent model or a market moderating model, as in Germany. So it's worth looking into what is the most effective way and the most appropriate way for Ukraine. Another example that we can look at in reconstruction after a crisis is Rovaniemi in Finland, which brought together land banking with purposeful housing investment. Soon after the war in Finland, the Land Acquisition Act was passed. Some years after the war, there was initially quite a period of chaos, and later amendments facilitated the construction of housing with the support of long-term, low-interest state loans. Municipalities were able to purchase brownfield sites and farmland to address in advance of needs, to address needs. People could also exchange their land if they could not afford to develop it in exchange for a home which was built by the municipality. Municipalities became, in this way, quite significant land bankers through their right of expropriation, which they gained through that Land Acquisition Act. And they also had control over planning. You can see very similar instruments used in South Korea, in Seoul, after the 1953 war, and also in Singapore, which hand in glove in the Land Resettlement Act plays a very significant role in providing housing. There again, our friend ARA, the housing, what was then called ARAVA, channeled funds towards the municipalities. Municipalities drew up housing programs appropriate to the needs in different home ownership, rental, not-for-profit, and developed the housing. And you can see in this little picture here, there's a man in the middle. This is a much loved national architect and who was responsible for creating a plan for the town, also for designing some of the housing, using local materials, respecting cultural preferences. And he also was later involved in designing the town hall, in the cultural centre and so on. So this city actually became a source of national pride and is visited by many architects from all around the world to see how it evolved. But behind every good plan is a good administration. And here is a description of how ARA works in bringing together grants, also undertaking credit analysis of proposals, giving guarantees to those, and targeted interest rate subsidies for the best, most efficient loans that sit behind affordable housing development. There are social criteria on needs base, which are developed at the municipal level. And there is also legislation which covers those organisations which receive public subsidies. They have to perform according to a limited profit or non-profit model. Rents vary according to the area portfolio costs, the cost of rents here, and the rents cover the amortization and the services provided. For those whose income drops too low to pay for that, there is rent assistance when required. With regard to the land is leased, it's not purchased. There are also cost benchmarks for the production of the dwellings. The tenant provider also pays a discounted land tax. And in terms of the financing, there are long-term low-cost loans. They can come from any bank, but most commonly they come from Unifin, which is a public investment bank owned by the people of Finland. This is a public financial intermediary, and it offers a long-term loan for affordable housing provision. They don't just provide rental housing, they also provide right to occupy housing, which is a form of sort of shared equity ownership. So people are able to stay in that as long as they like, and in addition to a contribution to the ownership, they pay a lower rent. It has significant advantages in being very, very secure also. So I won't move along, and I'll perhaps hand over the reins to Michelle Norris, who's with me to continue the presentation.
Thank you, Julie, and I'm really pleased to be talking to you today. As Julie mentioned, as well as being an academic, I'm involved in working with the Irish government, particularly on financing social housing and affordable housing. And I was involved with Julie in drafting the section of the Housing 2030 report, which looked at the finance and funding of affordable housing. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. Could you just move on the slide, Julie, to finance? I'm reliant on Julie to move the slide. So obviously, finance is vital for housing provision. Housing is expensive to provide, it's expensive to renovate, it's expensive to build, and unlike other goods and services, you have generally to pay the full costs of financing housing upfront before you consume it. So it's always a challenge for governments. So in the Housing 2030 report, we look at all the different tools which policymakers can use to provide affordable housing, finance affordable housing, but also to shape the market so the market doesn't undermine housing affordability. So some of the tools we look at relate to governments and non-profit bodies being involved in financing affordable housing. So they include public investment through, Julie mentioned revolving funds, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, through government subsidies for affordable housing provision, and through public banks, which often lend for affordable housing provision and exist in many Western European countries, either as banks or as specialist bodies that lend for affordable housing provision called special purpose financial intermediaries. And for a 10-year period, I was chair of the Irish special purpose financial intermediary called the Housing Finance Agency, which is a small agency that borrows on international markets and then lends on the money at long-term fixed rate for affordable housing provision. And that model works very well in Ireland. There are also European level banks that lend, public banks that lend, including the European Investment Bank that plays a very, very important role in lending for affordable housing provision. So that's how governments can get directly involved in funding or financing affordable housing. We also talk in the report about how governments can also steer private investment in various ways to ensure it's investing in the right type of housing and ensure it's not undermining housing affordability. And we talk about how they can do that through tax. And we talk about the importance of non-profit providers in providing affordable housing, either government agencies or non-governmental organizations. So in the report, we look in a lot of depth at the different instruments that governments use to subsidize affordable housing provision. So some of these relate to the capital sides, the cost of building or buying affordable housing, and they include things like tax subsidies. For instance, affordable housing providers, NGOs, are generally non-profit bodies not subject to tax. Either governments or affordable housing providers, social housing landlords may invest their own equity in the form of a lump sum of money or a grant. Loans are extremely important source of finance for affordable housing, ideally very long-term loans to keep the costs down, and ideally fixed rate. Certainly in Ireland, that model of providing fixed rate finance enabled by the European Investment Bank has been very useful because it means small affordable housing providers can manage the risk of interest rate fluctuations, and the finance is just easier for them to manage. And then Julie also mentioned land banking and provision of land. So that's a very important subsidy for affordable housing provision. Then the other aspect to financing housing is the revenue costs, the management and maintenance costs, the costs of repaying debt. And we talk about the different mechanisms that can be used to cover those costs. So rent paid by tenants is very, very important. And particular types of rental calculation mechanisms are particularly useful for affordable housing provision and to ensure affordability for tenants. I'll talk about that in a minute. Governments often subsidise the costs of rents where rents are viewed as unaffordable for people. So that's how they achieve affordability, and that enables the repayment of the housing development loans. Or sometimes they provide other types of operating subsidies to affordable housing providers, typically subsidies for the interest provision. So next slide. So the details of how you fund or finance affordable housing can be very complex and vary between different countries. And we look at this in a lot of depth in the Housing 2030 report, and I'd encourage people here to read the report. But sometimes I think when we discuss providing affordable housing, we sometimes become overwhelmed with the details of what to do, and we forget the big picture. And in the Housing 2030 report, we do highlight that there is a certain model or approach to affordable housing financing, a kind of high-level model that's more effective in our view. So I've just illustrated it in this slide. So you can see on the red or pink side of the slide, models that have what we call a closed circuit of finance. So the finance for government is protected just for affordable housing provision, or the other non-financial supports government provides, like government guarantees or like land. The value of these subsidies is retained long-term in the system and recycled to provide more affordable housing over the long term. And the opportunities for extracting these subsidies out of the system through privatization, for instance, or through profit taking are minimized. So those types of affordable housing financing models have proven much more effective in the Western European countries that have larger social housing sectors and more stable social housing sectors. And they've also proved very effective in enabling counter-cyclical investment in social housing. So in other words, enabling countries like Austria and Denmark to invest in provision of additional social housing at times when the market has experienced a downturn and there's less private supply. So next slide, please, Julie. So in the report, we look at some examples of affordable housing systems in different countries that kind of adhere to this types of model. So some examples, for instance, are the social housing provision in Austria, which is extremely extensive, and the legislation which underpins it. So in Austria, both municipalities, local government, and non-governmental organizations called limited profit housing associations provide social housing, but they have very extensive regulation of these organizations through legislation, which requires them to set rents just at cost levels. Cost rents are quite an effective mechanism of ensuring housing is affordable and also ensuring we can afford to finance it. And it requires them by law to invest any surplus they generate back into the housing. So once the loans they took out to build the housing are repaid and the tenants continue paying rent, that money then is used by the affordable housing provider to reinvest in more affordable housing. Julie talked a bit about Finland, and Finland has a different way of providing affordable housing through municipalities. And through the Central Government Development Agency, ARA, but their model is very similar. So it's essentially a large revolving fund where loans are given out, they're repaid, and then reinvested. And then Denmark, which also has very large social housing stock by European standards, about 22% of households are in social housing. It's provided by many different non-profit organizations. But once they have repaid the loans, the government loans and the private bank loans taken out to fund the social housing through the tenants' rents, which are linked to cost, once the loans are repaid, the money then accrues to a national fund, and that's used to fund more social housing provision, and it's also used to fund renovation, which is increasingly important priority as we become more concerned about climate neutral housing and energy efficiency. So next slide, please, Julie. So I just wanted to go into an example of this in practice in a bit more depth, and that is the case of Vienna. So it's very well known that Vienna has a very large social housing stock, but what's not as well known is a lot of it was constructed as part of the reconstruction of the city after World War II. So after the war, Vienna had very, very significant war damage to about 20% of the housing stock. And they were one of the countries that received funding from the Marshall Plan. And that, together with additional tax levies on household incomes and on corporations, was used to fund public investment loans, long-term loans to municipal housing companies and housing associations to rebuild the housing. Next slide, Julie. So Vienna organizes this and continues to build very large levels of, provide very large levels of social housing supply, very, very high quality in terms of energy efficiency, using this funding model. And it's underpinned by long-term housing plans that are agreed both by politicians and by civil society groups. It's a corporatist model, and industry, civil society groups, trade unions are involved in these planning, and this model's lasted over 70 years. So next slide, please. So what is distinctive about the Vienna model, and what can other countries take away? The Irish government has recently passed new legislation on affordable housing provision, and it has borrowed a lot of ideas from what's gone on in Vienna and in Austria and their approach. So their approach is based on linking rents to cost. So they're affordable, but they cover the costs of delivery. They also limit the profits which affordable housing providers can make. They can make profits, but they're more profits in theory than profits in practice because they have to reinvest them in housing. So that means essentially this is a revolving fund. And this model of financing affordable housing seems, very simple, but it is very effective. And also their business activities are limited, and the activities of their personnel are limited. So people can't move into the private or for-profit sector, and there's very strict auditing. So one final slide from me. I mentioned the role of tax, and tax can also be very useful in steering the private investment, so it doesn't undermine housing affordability and can contribute to providing affordable housing. So tax exemptions for non-profit providers are extremely useful. Taxes can be used to discourage speculation in housing, to discourage vacancy, and to ensure that private housing remains affordable and is used effectively in the public interest. So we look at lots of different examples of how this is done in the report. One example is in the US, the low-income housing tax credit has delivered about 3 million units of affordable housing. And also France has been extremely effective in using tax to discourage vacancy and encourage landlords and owners to ensure their dwellings are occupied and the housing stock is used efficiently. So I'll hand back to Julie now.
Oh, Julie, we cannot hear you. Yeah.
We've used up more than our time, so I'm going to cut to the conclusions of this section. We had also in the report, of course, attention to climate neutral housing, and there's a very good chapter in there which is worth looking at on the kind of legislative context in Europe that's been very successful in encouraging ensuring that buildings today consume only half as much as typical buildings did in 1980. So the power of actual regulation in this field is really vital, and good examples can be found in the German building code, also in the national building regulation in France, requiring renovations to be obligatory to these standards as well. And also the role of national, in particular city governments, in the way in which they plan not around cars, but around people and around people being able to walk comfortably and safely, or cycle, or use electric buses, for example, to move around their cities, rather than being stuck in traffic, as I know what it's like in Kiev, for example, to be stuck in traffic there. So enabling people to live much more healthy and active and environmentally friendly ways. So the report also covers those issues. Finally, though, in the products, if you like, of Housing 2030, what does it give people? In addition to the report, there's some great podcasts. Unfortunately, they're only in English at the moment. There's one in particular by Gregor Gaida from the EIB, which is a fantastic tight little podcast, and I'd like to give a plug for that one. And you'll hear many of the messages coming back today, I'm sure. But also to stress that Housing 2030 informed a regional action plan, in which the goals of it in section B are all the conclusions of Housing 2030, and the Ukrainian Minister for Housing endorsed this plan in the ministerial meeting at the UNEC in October 2021. So have a look at those targets and see how they could be progressed. And this is just a final thank you to those supporting this particular project, in particular also the Housing Agency in Ireland and the Housing Finance and Development Centre of Finland, who provided some support to Housing Europe for this to take place. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Michelle, for this wonderful presentation. I think there are a lot of interesting information and also useful information for Ukrainian context. And some of the viewers from our Facebook translation, they're asking whether it will be possible to access the presentation later. And as I understand, it will be posted on the website of Housing 2030, or
that's the goal. If it isn't on there already today on the website, it will be in the next 24 hours. So you just go housing2030.org, and then there's a section called events, and on there it should be accessible to download it. I think it'll be in a PDF in Ukrainian and in English, because that's only 4 megabytes, and that's possible for most people to do. So yes, definitely it's there for people to have in both languages.
Great, thank you. I've also posted in the chat a link to Housing 2030 website, and there you can find more information about the issues that we've discussed here today. And the full version of the report is also available there for free. So please join and read more. Yeah, thank you once again for your presentations. And now we can move forward to the presentations by Katerina Zisimopoulou about European Investment Bank activities and what they are doing for financing social and affordable housing. And Katerina, should I share the presentation?
Let me just try. Hello from me. I'm a newcomer in the bank and in the urban development division, so bear with me. I have learned a lot from dear colleague Gregor Gaida, and he will join us if he can do it, but I will start without him, so I will share my presentation with you, and please inform me if you can see it.
Yes, we can see it perfectly well.
Okay, let's go on then. I'm trying to play it. Do you see the presentation mode?
No, we only see the, yes, now we see the presentation. Now we see the presentation mode.
Okay, great. So, hello, I'm Katerina, and I work in the European Investment Bank in the Urban Development Division. I will try to present briefly after listening to the very interesting presentation of Housing 2030 and all the good examples from various cities. We'll present specifically what European Investment Bank does to finance social and affordable housing, which is actually a very important sector for EIB. So these charts show that between in the 5 years between 2016 and 2020, EIB invested roughly 10 billion euros, 9.5 to be exact, worldwide to support social and affordable housing. So 95% of this was in the EU. The countries involved are Germany, France, Netherlands, Austria, and Ireland, and then a smaller portion follows for the rest of them. And as we can see, which is also very important, 62% of the investments contribute to climate action. So this is an important lesson to learn for EIB at least. Sustainable investments are promoted. So we align with the Paris alignment and the EU taxonomy regulation to support sustainable investments in housing. And I will come back to that later because it is very important for us. So I move on to this distribution of the population by tenure status. The bluish chart is referring to rents. So there is an important problem we have identified in the housing sector. There is a high demand for affordable housing all over Europe, not just in specific countries. The Eurostat statistics are not very encouraging. Among the EU population, 7% almost was unable to keep their homes adequately warm, and I can suspect this portion is rising from 2020 since the statistic was published. And for many households, the largest single expenditure, as we heard before, each month is in relation to housing costs. This housing cost overburden rate shows that a large share of the population spends almost 40% or more on housing. And in certain countries, like my home country, Greece, this is outrageous. Large cities are especially affected also by these problems. And no matter this fact, investments in housing developments have declined. Our studies shown since 2010. So this leads to two significant problems in the area of affordable housing. There are less and less good available accommodations, and the demand is increasing. So there has been an EU study that, according to this, an annual shortfall of around 6 billion euros exists for social and affordable housing development. This means that in this sector, investment must increase by about roughly 25%. Of course, we cannot completely fill in this gap, but we can try, and we do try, and ensure that the living in cities is not just for people with high incomes. And it is indeed possible to finance well-functioning public social and affordable housing system that is both dependent on central government money and municipal budgets. But our experience has shown that there must be a plan that can make this housing system self-financing. There should be a goal to reach this target after a period of time. So this is fundamental to the cause of.
Katerina, I am sorry to interrupt you, but I think that we are still on the slide about tenure contracts.
I move on to just to show. Sorry, I ran. Yes. So this is a map of Amsterdam that shows housing units that are indeed integrated in the city. So for EIB, there are best practices that have been very much successful, and we have arrived to some conclusions based on our portfolio, our past year portfolio. We'll present some conclusions in the end, a summary, but this is just to show that social inclusion can be achieved also by the location of investments within the city and the urban fabric. So targeting the vulnerable people in our society, poor people and single parents and people with disabilities, or young people who cannot have the income to pay for a home is very important. We have noticed that the need and the demand is high. So what are the EIB objectives regarding the housing sector? The housing market is indeed in crisis, and the cost of housing facilities often takes up a significant proportion of the income. We have already established that. Cities and housing associations are in the process and try their best to implement ambitious investment programs and to create affordable housing. These examples are from the Netherlands. EIB Finance plays an important role in providing the necessary funds for these programs, and the EIB provides direct financing to large private and public housing associations, with which a loan agreement can support the investment program over several years, and that often involves a large number of properties. So in addition to direct financing, the EIB cooperates with partners such as regional development banks, as the one mentioned in the previous presentation, which pass the EIB funds to smaller projects within the cities. The many customers see this as an advantage because it enables them to take on large investment sums in a relatively short time, and upgrade and modernization of the existing building stock, housing stock, can be financed in this way as well. Cost-effective housing, affordable housing, is a key objective of EIB financing in the housing sector, and it is also part of sustainability awareness bonds. Access to social and affordable housing is actually part of them. This is a new development. So I move on to explain a little bit how this goal to reach financial sustainability of affordable and social housing system can be achieved. The issue of financial sustainability of a housing system can be examined in two levels. The first one, and the most important one, is the sustainability, the financial sustainability for housing operations. That means that they should have sufficient means and funds available at any time to finance the operations and maintenance of the housing. As a minimum in a housing system, we want to see the source of financing, it usually rents, is enough to cover operating and maintenance expenditures of the housing. So we regulate rents to manage, at least to cover the operational cost, and this we can see in the first in this chart, it's a typical distribution of income in a society. So OPEX are the operational expenditure, and we try to cover that with rents. Then there is a second level that it needs to be covered to reach a financial sustainability of a housing system. And this means providing funds for housing construction and providing new units to cover the needs of housing for the capital repairs and expansion. So that is the second level of financial sustainability, and it is noted in the chart as CAPEX. And well-functioning systems that we have observed and from lessons learned in Western Europe have this financial sustainability on both levels. So both on the operating expenditure and the capital expenditure level. And then a well-functioning housing system should be able to regulate the rents and reach probably public funding resources that can cover both expenditures and be able to construct new housing, reconstruct and rehabilitate, provide the scheduled repairs of the housing stock. Obviously, this is not so easy to achieve because housing must also be affordable and available to those who need it. So we are regulating rents and offering housing on lower rates, lower than the market. And fortunately, when we discuss public housing, it is a little easier because profits do not need to be generated, and also we don't need usually to purchase the land. So almost half of the expenditure, of the capital expenditure, do not need to be covered by providers of social and affordable housing. Still, the other half does need to be covered somehow, and this is done with a system of payment of certain capex grants by central governments for social and affordable housing providers. But there also are systems that do not depend totally on those grants or the state. And these systems work also in two ways. One way focuses on the property value that is created by building new housing assets. And this value created after building, for example, a new residential area can be somehow monetized by selling parts of the housing to the market. And then the provider can recuperate some of the costs and can increase the capital in order to finance new housing. This is a model that we see in the Netherlands, as presented also before. The other way that the housing providers can achieve financial sustainability for CAPEX is by expanding the range of people who are eligible for affordable housing. So by expanding to people with a slightly higher income, so who have a middle income, we can achieve financial sustainability of the system. This is something we see in places like France and Poland, where people who can live in these entities are people with middle income, also in Germany and the Netherlands. They are people who pay the rent that is required to cover the operational costs, but also capital expenditures of housing, and manage and enable the housing system to build and maintain, expand and sustain. So these are the two levels of financial sustainability of affordable and social housing system. To add something on top of that, there are, it was mentioned in a previous presentation that long-term finance is also crucial by various institutions and local development banks. So I move on. EIB assists countries and providers of social and affordable housing, we provide loans, but still the governments have to make decisions and decide how to introduce in the national legislation the general housing policies, if there are none, or regulate them and modify them in order to achieve their goals. And most countries, it was mentioned, that have housing policies that are focusing not only on rent regulation and adjustment, but also on property ownership. This has been the case in my home country, for example, Greece. In some cases, it's well grounded in the notion of the people, and it cannot very easily be changed. But this has resulted in elevating actually property prices. So governments may want to consider if this is the way to support the market. So change, for example, is probably needed in order to provide more affordable housing for as many people as possible. And in order to do that, and shift the interest and redirect the subsidy to the supply or side to public housing, it is interesting to consider the system that obliges, for example, private developers to build social and affordable housing and transfer ownership of a certain part of the units to public sector entities. This is actually a good idea to address the issue of lack of capital, because then this housing is paid by the private sector, and this generates a positive question. Do we want to mix people of different income levels living in the same housing complex or area and create mixed income level neighborhoods? Actually, the answer to this is yes. Many countries have shown, like we saw Amsterdam before, that social mix is a positive element, and urban policies should try to increase this condition. The opposite is to create a ghetto or a gated community, and that leads to concentration of social problems and should be avoided. So thinking about housing affordability actually can bring a lot of implications in the housing market and lead to urban benefits. It is costly, and governments should be ready to invest in this sector. But in the long term, it would lead to financially independent housing systems, and this is possible to be achieved. And maybe it will not take 1 or 2 years, maybe a decade or even more, but it is worth it. So state guaranteed loans that provide low interest rates and units received for free, as mentioned before, from the private sector, which is practice in Ireland or France. Maybe sale of some units are ways to make a housing system sustainable, economically viable. And I will not keep you very longer. Just to sum up the conclusions, what is actually social and affordable housing? How important is it for our society? It is a crucial issue to be considered. It is not charity, it is a need. People have a right to affordable housing, and this is very important to understand. EIB supports affordable housing for several reasons, and first of all, for social justice. Every person has a right to adequate housing that respects his or her needs, and it is not just about reducing inequality. It stipulates workforce and mobility, enables better urban planning. A sensitive housing policy also means is a means of diffusing potential tensions that can arise from a concentration of different population groups and the lack of social mixing. Furthermore, we can see across Europe that housing markets do not provide enough housing for marginalized population groups. This sometimes has far-reaching consequences for public health, safety, and social cohesion. So we in EIB, this is the affordable housing is done predominantly by regulating rents. And at some point, governments must decide on who is eligible to actually have access in this system. And many ways were mentioned also before. But regulating the rents and increasing the people who are eligible is the concept that is leads to more successful housing systems. I would like to sum up to highlight here the importance of energy efficiency and sustainable development for cities and communities. This is a very important goal and a very important lesson learned from EIB, that quality housing, high quality housing, energy efficient housing is very important because it decreases the costs and can really create affordable living conditions. It makes in economic and ecological sense to invest in high energy efficiency standards in housing. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Katerina, for your presentation. And now I think that we can move to the part of these questions and discussion. I invite our listeners and participants to either write their questions in chat or also raise a hand and then voice their question. And while we are still waiting for the questions from the audience, I, of course, have a question to all of you. And it's also about different finance instruments, because on the one hand, for example, in Ukraine, housing finance instruments, they are mostly directed towards supporting home ownership and new housing construction. And there are low interest loans. There was recently an attempt to once again launch a mortgage in Ukraine. On the other hand, social housing is underfunded, and the public housing stock was and still is very scant in Ukraine. And what are the risks or maybe also advantages of this strategy of directing the finance mostly towards supporting home ownership? Yeah, Julie, I see that you're ready to answer.
Well, I think the rate of home ownership in Ukraine is already extremely high. We know it's around 96, 97%, so extremely high. Therefore, the balance of effort should be providing choice and other alternatives. Clearly, there's already a lot of support and a lot of policy effort driving this. We have learned, sadly, also in the rest of Europe, that driving the expansion of mortgage markets doesn't necessarily mean also increased home ownership rates. It can simply mean more expensive housing. So by the expansion of Europe's mortgage market since the 1990s, we've actually seen declines of home ownership in the United States, in UK, and it's certainly plateaued in many, many countries. I know my own, I'm an Australian. We've seen home ownership declining, especially amongst young people. And they're, of course, the new entrants coming in. So they're delaying home ownership. They're not having as many children. They're not leaving home. They're staying with mum and dad or wherever, overcrowding or even couch surfing, because there are not good enough alternatives for them. And what we've tried to show today is that there can be good alternatives to home ownership with very similar security qualities to home ownership. Some of them even offer equity as that is affordable in that. We learnt about Finland's right of occupancy, for example, that enables them to have 15% stake in the equity of that equity rental home. So outright home ownership is not a nirvana. It can be also in times of turbulence and stress, can be incredibly high risky. And there would be no more risky time than now for Ukraine. And we've seen how over numerous types of crises in Ukraine, the impact that's had on the mortgage markets. And we've also know that in Kiev, it's one of the most expensive housing markets in Europe relative to incomes. It's actually on par with Sydney. So, 13 times, 11 times your annual income. That is no nirvana that we should not be working for. What we want is a housing system which doesn't cause stress, that enables people to have secure, safe, fulfilling lives, choices that they can move when they want to, easily to where they'd like to live, perhaps for work, perhaps for grandparents, or perhaps for education, but that the housing system shouldn't get in the way of that. And a good, well-functioning rental system is actually pretty vital to that. So I think that the effort really should be in the area of a well-functioning, adequate rental system, which it takes care that the costs are not exorbitant, that thinks about long term. Switzerland and Germany are no second-rate housing systems. They are the creme de la creme. I know plenty of even bankers who are living in rental housing, which they find much of significantly good quality and easy to move between cities. So I think the stigma attached to renting really just has to be reassessed in Ukraine if it can provide a really good quality alternative. And that takes determined institutional building and good regulation as well as strategic investment in great models, which it can do. Perhaps the others have something to say.
May I add something to that?
Sure.
Julie, I could not agree more. Maybe I tired you a little bit with all those charts, but this is exactly what they are trying to prove, that a good public, self-sufficient public social and affordable housing system can be self-sufficient and can only do it. In order to achieve that, it must be rent regulated, at least for the vulnerable parts of the society. There must be a choice to find a rented place. Like you mentioned, the young people are the most needed at the most in need at the moment. Young graduates to delay their lives, actually. They postpone having a family just because of the issue of affordability. And coming from Greece, which faces this problem of home ownership, a system based on home ownership, it's a failure, and it should be balanced, at least, I would say. And I'm only sorry that my colleague Gregos is not here to share his experiences. And I hope I could convince you that this is the only solution. We have many examples. And also this system can really produce high quality examples and come in the full, become a leader in providing sustainable solutions to urban problems that cannot be addressed privately. The urban heat island effect, which is really a problem like in Vienna, like as you mentioned before, can only be addressed by very gestures that are important and can only be achieved by public housing system. Thank you.
Thank you. Michelle, would you like to add something to this?
Just to say, well, I agree with the previous comments, and I think in terms of home ownership and the advantages and disadvantages, we need to differentiate between home ownership where there's low debt and people own a lot of equity in their home, and this is an asset and it's a very important way of redistributing wealth, and home ownership which is underpinned by very large levels of debt compared to income. So the latter has lots and lots of disadvantages. And these were very obvious in Ireland, where I live. After the global financial crisis, we also had very large levels of home ownership, and we had very, very high levels of mortgage arrears after the banking crash. So for some households, particularly on lower incomes, debt-supported home ownership is not easy to sustain, or may not be possible to sustain at certain parts of their lives. They may not be able to sustain it as young people. When they get older and are promoted in their jobs, they may be able to do so. So for those people who can't sustain home purchase with the mortgage, we need to provide alternatives. And as Julie mentioned, if affordable housing and social housing is properly regulated, tenants' rights are regulated, it also offers the security without the unaffordability. So in my view, it has very, very strong attractions. And there is also the issue of choice, which is important.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted also to move to the question of social housing providers. For example, in Ukraine, in the legislation, we have this instrument of social housing, and the main provider and also maintainer of social housing should be local governments in Ukraine. But also in your presentations, you've mentioned there are some other instruments, some other models that, for example, public-private partnership or non-profit organizations could be providers of social housing. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, about this, let's say, alternative providers of social housing, that not only government should be responsible for that, but also other actors?
We, in the report, we look at all the different organizational structures you can use to provide social housing. So in some countries, such as Ireland, where I live, it's provided directly by municipalities. In other countries, it's provided by organizations which are controlled by municipalities, but are separate companies. We call them arm's length providers. Cooperatives are cooperative organizations are very common providers of social housing in Europe, and also non-profit providers. In my view, even though non-profit organizations are private, they're not government organizations, they are charities and non-profit organizations. So it's very important that there is a non-profit ethos and delivery model underpinning social housing, rather than a for-profit model that can take some of the subsidies out in the form of profits. That's the key issue, and that's in some ways more important than the type of non-profit organization. However, there are advantages to having specialist housing providers providing social housing. I see this in my own country, where our municipalities are responsible for housing and roads and libraries and parks, and it can be very difficult for them to manage the social housing over the long term. And the elected members of the council, we call them councillors, often like to sell the social housing off because it's popular with voters. So in the long term, in Western Europe, the countries that have maintained large social housing sectors have generally done it by providing the social housing outside municipalities, sometimes by organizations controlled by municipalities, but not directly. Now, in Ukraine, I would suggest the critical thing is to get provision going. So if that works and municipalities are there and they're set up and they're organized, existing organizations, by all means use them. In the longer term, it may be worth exploring some alternative models so you do get the specialist skills, skilled providers that are experienced in housing management and maintenance, providing the housing.
Thank you. Do you, Julie, also want to add something, or Katerina?
Yeah, I have something, and perhaps also something to share. We did a review of international social housing systems and their regulation, and there is a nice set of tables in that, which is sort of the positives and negatives of the different organisational forms set. Now, I might just put that in the chat straight away, or I'll do that eventually before we finish. But yeah, I mean, what Michelle was saying about, well, what sits in the constitution of the organisation and its, if you like, the entity's rules and procedures and its mandate, that's very, very important. And also, how are its rents circulated and reinvested? How is it? It is possible, for example, in my own home country, you saw that those revenues actually went eventually into general revenue and paid for the health budget and paid for the other things, and gradually investment in capital in repairing those buildings, in growing them, there wasn't any, because it hadn't been ring-fenced and protected in government. So that revolving idea is really, really important. The other thing that we haven't talked about much is about the participation and empowerment of the residents involved, and how do they sit in the governance of these organisations. In cooperatives, obviously, they're structurally embedded as members. In associations, they might be as well. In public housing, perhaps there's somebody sitting on the board. Maybe there are tenant representatives. Perhaps there are supervisory structures or feedback platforms. So we haven't really talked about that, but they do differ significantly. And you do get cases of public housing which is not very empowering for the tenants involved. And you do get forms of tenant-run cooperatives which can be, quite empowering, but also quite exclusive. So, there are positives and negatives, and we talk a bit about that in another report, which I'll share with the readers in the chat. We do have a section actually in 2030 on governance, and that's really worth having a critical look at. And forms of tenant participation and involvement is also included in the report.
Thank you. Katerina, would you like to add something to this question? Or if you please could turn on your microphone. I cannot hear you.
No, I have not. It all has been mentioned, just that some private developments could also contribute according to the model that requests them to give part of their developments for affordable housing and transfer ownership to the cities. This is a model that can also be considered in some cases, depending on what the provider or the municipalities or the government, the regional governments need to achieve.
Thank you. We also have a question in chat. I will read it so everyone who's watching us on Facebook could also know what are we talking about. And Lydia is asking, thinking about the imbalances between the demand and supply side of social housing. In your view, who should have the priority to access such housing? what criteria are used in other countries to decide who can live in these accommodations?
I think it should be as broad as it possibly can be, and reflect on, needs as well, and prioritize and shape it towards needs as well. So you see the broadest model, of course, is in the Austrians, but there you see the limited profit housing associations reach about 80% of the income spectrum, and the municipal housing companies there reach about 60% of the income spectrum, so little over the middle range. So, and everything below. So they are more targeted. In the interests of ethically dealing with the most needy, it's important, but it's also important that all forms of tenure address the needs as well. So we shouldn't just have one form of tenure which deals with the neediest, but all forms of housing is potentially able to reach those who need it. There are, of course, greater risks involved for home ownership amongst low-income, precariously employed people in taking on a long-term mortgage contract. And we see the difference, the impact of that in the United States, where many walked away from their homes, unable to pay their mortgages, simply handed in their keys to the bank, only to be snapped up by Blackstone en masse, those homes. And we see the consequences of that monopoly in Sweden actually today, where there's a massive private equity fund owning the housing there. So I think it's a political discussion, but it's also one about financial feasibility. It's also one about social inclusion, and also not wanting to have a social stigma attached to a particular form of housing as well. So you have some of these social housing systems which I would call ambulance services. It's not my term, it's a term used by Professor Mark Stevens, ambulance service. There are others that are much more, if you like, not just dealing with so-called market failure, but actually shaping better markets. Economist Mariana Mazzucato talks a lot about using instruments to shape better markets. One of them is the housing system, and being involved in that and creating a better home for everybody. You can see the impact that can have at scale, again, in the Netherlands and in Vienna, where with half of the rental market at least being in this sector has a positive influence on the broader housing system, not only in terms of affordability, but in terms of standards. So the housing standard of the Viennese limited profit housing is superior by a significant way than the private rental housing, actually, which needs the public subsidy at the moment. So, it's historical, cultural, economic, and it's a very good debate to have. So interestingly, in Finland, it's a fairly broad-based system. They do prioritise people who are homeless and in need of housing. But you see there, because of the scale of it being 1 in 4 or 5 dwellings produced this way, purposefully this way, they can reach a much broader population, young people, older people, students, people who are homeless, people who have middle incomes and families. And so it is much more culturally mainstream and unstigmatized. As Katerina says, it's not charity, it's an essential right, it's essential good. Yeah.
Thank you. If Michelle, Katerina, would you like to add something?
can I just add to that? I mean, there are two broad models used. One, income, it's targeting on the basis of income. Some countries have very large, wide spectrum of incomes who can access social housing. And the big benefit of that is the tenure doesn't tend to be stigmatized and people can afford to pay cost rents to help subsidize its provision. In other countries, there is an income limit which is lower, and Ireland, where I live, is one of them. Now, obviously, where there's a lot of need, you have to prioritize people on lower income. The other issue I would flag is just discrimination. So there is a strong argument for targeting social housing at households that are most likely to face discrimination in the private market. So this has been a major issue in Ireland. It's not just an issue of income, but for instance, single men make up the vast majority of our homeless population, and they have a lot of trouble securing private housing to rent on the market, particularly as they get older. So there's a strong effort now to try target social housing at that group. Also very large households with lots of children, and in some cases ethnic minority households. We have an indigenous nomadic population, Irish travellers, who have faced a lot of discrimination in the private market and can't secure housing that way. So there is an argument, not just in terms of income, but in terms of the type of social housing you provide, in terms of the size of the dwellings, that you can help address the needs of these types of households that are most likely to face discrimination on the market and least likely to be able to provide their own housing.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I think that we are running a bit out of time, so maybe we will also have a few minutes for some final remarks and conclusions from this event.
So just on my part, thank you. And I would just want to finish with this remark that the EIB sees itself as EU's climate bank, and energy efficiency is a very important part of our work's DNA, regardless of sector. But our focus in public housing developments is on social and affordable housing with the highest possible energy efficiency standards. And in private, in housing developments, we focus on energy-related renovations and on new buildings with energy standards that are significantly higher than the regulations. And this results in housing that can be affordable even to the most vulnerable, economically vulnerable. So economy and ecology are go hand in hand to invest for EIB investments. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Julie, would you like to add something in conclusion of our event?
Yeah, I'm hoping to hoping people enthusiastic to become critically aware of all the different options available, all the different tools that can be used and combined in ways that reflect Ukraine's needs and preferences and ideals. Also for with attention to the situation, of course, dealing with the enormous pressure on the rental market and the need for that to be addressed through good regulation and attract long-term investment to affordable forms of housing, and particularly in the, if you like, non-home ownership sectors. Also to press on that in the future recovery of Ukraine, housing and home will be so central to the recovery that people can come back to, that they have somewhere they feel safe and secure and that they can afford. is so vital to the future recovery of Ukraine. So all hands on deck for a good housing system. And if Housing 2030 can help or be useful, then there's a lot of technical assistance behind it that would be so willing to be put to work, not only from Housing Europe itself and their 43,000 members, but also from UNECE, as well as their platform for government to government contacts and peer-to-peer, and also from UN Habitat as well. So Housing 2030 is very willing and keen to continue cooperation on this. Yeah.
Okay.
And can I say just finally, I'm really honoured to be asked to speak to you today. I hope you found some of the suggestions we made useful. There are lots of examples and lots of resources in the report and on the website, and hopefully ideas you can steal. Was the purpose of the initiative. And as Julie mentioned, we drew on expert advice from social and affordable housing providers right across the UNECE area. And many of those are very happy to offer advice and support. And we would be very happy to facilitate that. So just to say that, please use the resource. They're intended to be used and copied and applied elsewhere.
Thank you all. I'm very honored that you've agreed to participate in this event, and I hope that we will cooperate also in the future. As you know, now in Ukraine, there is an urge to renew housing policy, and I personally and we in Cedos also hope that this renewed housing policy will be more centered towards people and towards their needs and different groups of people. And this policy will be sustainable and will be able to provide this affordable and inclusive housing for all. And I think that maybe we can cooperate also about this in the future. And I will also say that we will make a Ukrainian version, short version written of this discussion, and we will publish it. So for all those who could not join us today because of the language barrier, we will also provide all the important outcomes of the discussion in the written form. Yeah, thank you once again, and hope to see you again in the future.
Okay, thanks for the initiative. Thank you.
Thank you for the initiative as well. Thank you for inviting.